Chapter 5, Do Happiness and Quality of Life Matter? Depression and the Lockdowns. Our lockdown response to COVID may have prevented a large number of COVID deaths. We all hope it has. But it unquestionably has inflicted enormous harms on us. The biggest harm, in my view, is that it has made us all more unhappy and thrown many of us into clinical depression. How many were thrown into depression? Ettman et al. Found these increases in the percentage of the U.S. population with depression symptoms. Summing the severe, moderately severe, and moderate increases, we threw 19.3% of the U.S. population into moderate to severe depression because of our response to COVID. Not because of COVID, but because of our response to COVID. Moderate to severe depression is classified as major depression. So we threw 19.3% of the U.S. population, or 63.3 million people, into major depression. I estimated in Chapter 3 that the lockdown response might have prevented 200,000 COVID deaths. We had in the U.S. in 2020 COVID deaths of 354,380. So we have thrown 178 people into major depression for each COVID death in 2020, and 316 people into major depression for each COVID death our policies may have averted. That is just the depression caused in the spring of 2020. Presumably some different people became depressed later, so this certainly understates the amount of depression caused by the lockdowns. And the estimate of 200,000 COVID deaths prevented by the lockdowns is generous and probably too high, as we will see in Chapter 23, so it is probably an overestimate. Essentially, all of that increase in depression is because of our response to COVID, not because of COVID. Grief at the death of loved ones, especially when those loved ones are elderly and sick, as the large majority of COVID dead are, is not a major cause of depression. And in any case, deaths have increased only about 10% in 2020. So even if death of a loved one was the sole cause of depression in our society, it would have caused only a 10% increase in depression, not a 327% increase as has happened. People become depressed basically because of a lack of social contact, a lack of friends, and a lack of feeling connected to others or appreciated and loved by others. Our COVID policy was to deliberately isolate everyone from each other. Order everyone to stay home, close restaurants, bars, churches, health clubs, schools, and businesses, and for the businesses that remained open, order everyone to work at home if possible. And order everyone to wear masks so we cannot see each other's faces. The policy was literally to reduce contact with other human beings as much as possible, and for the contact that cannot be prevented, order people to wear masks so they cannot see each other's faces. If you wanted a policy deliberately designed to make people unhappy, you could not have come up with a better policy. Note 1. It is as if our leaders have no familiarity with human beings and what makes them happy or what makes life valuable. Social connection is the source of nearly all of our happiness. Again, we threw 316 people into major depression for every one person whose COVID death we might have prevented. Was it worth it? It is comparing apples and oranges, so initially we might not be certain whether it is worth it to throw 316 people into major depression to save one life. Certainly we would think it was worth it to make one person unhappy for a while, or even depressed, in order to save one other person's life. Is there a way we can compare depression to deaths or lives saved? Yes, I think there is. Depression can be viewed as a lost time of life. If you could just go to sleep or be temporarily dead while you were depressed and wake up when it is over, you may well take that deal. If a depressed person believes his depression will never lift, he is in fact quite likely to kill himself. He is likely to prefer death to living with depression. Think about it this way. Would you rather now, at whatever age you are now, suffer major depression for the next 12 months, or would you rather, at the end of your life, whenever that will be, die 12 months earlier than you otherwise are going to die? I think it is not an easy choice, which shows it is fair to consider depression as lost time of life. I presented this idea of depression as lost time of life to a friend, and she said, no, it is worse than death. Death is oblivion. Depression is pain. So again, I think it is fair to consider time spent depressed as lost time of life, which means it can be compared to the time of life extended or saved when we prevent a COVID death. In chapters 2 and 3, I estimated that our lockdown response to COVID may be averting as many as 200,000 COVID deaths, and that the people dying of COVID have an average life expectancy of 4 years remaining, if they had not contracted the virus that causes COVID. So 200,000 COVID deaths averted times 4 years life expectancy equals 800,000 person years of life saved. The average episode of major depression lasts for 20 weeks, or 0.38 years. Solomon et al. So 63.3 million people thrown into major depression times 0.38 years equals 24 million person years of life lost. 30 times the person years of life saved in COVID deaths averted. 30 times. It should be noted that the depression number is not an estimate. It is actual measured increase in depression that has already happened and is continuing to happen. Footnote. In fact, it is low because it was the depression measured in April 2020. Those people presumably suffered depression for 20 weeks on average. But the lockdowns did not stop causing depression in the spring. More depression was undoubtedly caused by the lockdowns and restrictions throughout the rest of 2020 and 2021. Undoubtedly, many of the people depressed in the spring of 2020 continued to be depressed in the fall and winter of 2020 to 2021 as the lockdowns continued, and other people not depressed in the spring became depressed. So conservatively, I think we could multiply these depression numbers by 1.5 to get 36 million person years of life lost to major depression caused by the lockdowns in the US, which is 45 times the person years of life saved in COVID deaths averted, and 15 times the person years of life lost to COVID deaths over the entire epidemic. End footnote. In fact, they say the estimate is a minimum. It is just the increased depression in the spring of 2020. You could add as much as an equal amount of increased depression in the fall and winter of 2020 to 2021. The number of COVID deaths prevented is an estimate, but I think it is a generous estimate and more likely to be an overestimate than an underestimate. Even if it were a twofold underestimate and the COVID deaths prevented 400,000 COVID deaths, which is the most that they possibly could have prevented because that would have put us at herd immunity, as explained in Chapter 3, we would still be causing a minimum of 15 times as much lost time of life in time spent depressed as person years of life saved in COVID deaths averted. Look at that figure. The debate should be over. Was our COVID lockdown response worth it? Did it do more good than harm? Of course it was not worth it. Of course it did more harm than good. It's not even close. It's not even debatable. The only way you can conclude that our COVID response was worth it is if you consider depression, happiness, joy, and quality of life as of absolutely no consequence. The only way is if you say, I don't care about quality of life. I don't care about happiness and joy. The only thing that matters is duration of life. The only thing that matters is how long you live. If that is your attitude, then perhaps you can consider a lockdown response to COVID to have been worth it and good policy. Otherwise, no, you cannot. Note 1. Well, a couple of other ideas on how you could maximize depression came to mind when I tried to imagine what else you could do if your goal was to make people as unhappy as possible. You could bar them from owning dogs or other pets, and you could bar them from exercising. Aside from being emotionally connected to other people, the other major contributors to happiness are owning a pet, especially a dog, in other words, loving and being loved by a person who happens not to be human, and exercising. And we sort of have tried to prevent exercising. We closed the health clubs. Regarding pets, I have seen stories asking whether dogs and cats are carriers of COVID, as though if they were, we should get rid of them. It is an interesting thought experiment. Imagine you are an evil dictator whose goal is to maximize unhappiness as much as possible, but you do not want to do anything obviously evil like kill everyone's firstborn. What would you do? I think you would do pretty much exactly what we have done with the COVID lockdowns, but try the thought experiment yourself.